In Matthew chapter 18, we only got through verse 15, the first step, looking at the mechanics of our interpersonal relationships. We still have some very interesting things at which to arrive, conclusions to which we must come. The whole business of our relationship in the area of sin from brother to brother and forgiveness from brother to brother. But let's start over and see what we have discussed thus far. Moreover, if thy brother, the first part of the chapter, or much of the first part, has had to do with the sin of the unbelieving world. Verse 7, woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Then he moves beyond, he moves right into a church section, verses 15 through 20, in talking about brother-to-brother sin. And by the way, Matthew chapter 18, verse 17 is unique in that it's the first place that the term church appears in the New Testament, and it's about the only place in the Gospels where the term church appears. You find it there twice, ecclesia, church, the gathered out ones, the assembly. So it's a unique passage. That's why I call it a church passage here, because it's the first time church is found in the New Testament, and the only time it's found in the Gospels. Moreover, if thy brother, so we're talking about Christian to Christian, if thy brother shall sin against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. We're taking our time because I think time is needed and meant to be taken because of the fact that various steps are set forth here. Moreover, that means in addition to the sins of the world here, what about if you've got sin in the church? It's interesting that Jesus very realistically faces the fact that there will be sin in the church. People that speak of a utopian era where we're going to have a church or a group of people where no sins are committed at all by them, no sins are committed from one to the other. That's not in accord with what Jesus foresaw to be reality and to be what the church would be like whenever it came into being. If thy brother shall sin against thee. Then here's the biblical injunction. Go and tell him his fault. The very conclusion of the message, someone was asking the pertinent question, what if it's a woman? Well, go and tell him her fault. Or the question really was, if she is the one against whom the sin has been committed, then she can go and tell him his fault between thee and her, or thee and him alone. Question of secrecy. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8. Love, charity, love covereth the multitude of sins. There are many, many interpretations on that, and I think the most popular one is that love covers over the sins in the sense that it doesn't acknowledge them, doesn't recognize them, it forbears the person, it long suffers the case and doesn't deal with it, and that's not what he's talking about. We went back to Proverbs, and we'll be back to that connection between sin and the covering over and the tale bearing that we saw in the book of Proverbs in various verses on 3 occasions earlier. And here's the whole purpose of this episode and of what we call here a confrontation passage, as will be the other that we'll be to momentarily. If he shall hear thee, if he shall hear thee. See, he has to be humble enough, he has to be willing enough to listen, to hear. If he shall hear thee, and Jesus is assuming that the one who took the initiative, the one against whom the sin was committed, is the one who's right in the situation. If he shall hear thee, then thou hast gained thy brother. And we'll be back to that point, or that purpose, this final purpose in this form of discipline. We'll be back to that later. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. This whole process of thee and him alone, I said, gives the opportunity for the question to be discussed, the offense to be discussed more if it's necessary then, so that any explanations that are due can be given. Okay, now we move to the second point. This brings us into verse 16. That's the first thing that should be done whenever someone sins against you. He's presupposing that the one sinned against is the first one to recognize the sin. And I guess that's common sense. That's human nature there. Probably you feel more when someone sins against you than whenever you sin against someone else. I mean, you feel it a lot more. You feel it more quickly. It's easier to detect and discern. Sometimes it's so easy to detect and discern, you're not even discerning or detecting when someone sinned against you. It's just that whatever they said or did, you didn't like. It didn't feel good. So it only makes sense, and it's according to human nature that it's in this order and not the reverse. Second point, but if he will not hear thee. You present the case of sin, and he disagrees. Then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. He's quoting Deuteronomy 19:15. And here we see multiple things that need to be discussed. Number 1, the refusal of the man or the woman to listen. And he doesn't just mean that they plug up their ears or slam down the phone or refuse to open your letter or don't greet you at the door, but they refuse to be convinced by what you say. Not just, but if he will not hear thee. You know what we mean when he wouldn't hear me. Well, he heard what we said, but he wouldn't listen to the intent of agreeing with us and on that basis doing something about it. So if you can't convince him, if he is not convinced, in that sense, if he does not listen or if he does not hear thee, there's one thing that has to be determined right away. Then take with thee 1 or 2 more. Well, is it 1 or 2? Should you take 1 or 2? Or 1 or 2? Or what about 3? That in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Do the people that you take have to be witnesses of the event, of the sin that's been committed? So that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. Okay, let's go back to this first point under this second step then, and that's the subject of whether or not the person will endure, as it were, sound doctrine. In the first step, verse 15, Jesus is assuming the maturity of true Christians. I mean, this just is so obvious and so plain to me. And it must not be in reality, or he wouldn't have gone on and given us these other steps here. But he is assuming, he's presupposing the maturity of true Christians. And what I mean by that is that the last part of verse 15 will be able to be fulfilled. Thou hast gained thy brother. He's assuming the maturity of true Christians so that the one who sinned is mature enough, which means he is humble enough, which means that he is meek enough, which means he is biblically, scripturally, to the letter and to the spirit of the Old and New Testament, sensitive enough to know from your statements, your evidence that you bring before him, that he has indeed committed a sin against you. And we were talking about this a little last time. Too many people will just pass that all. They take it as a personal affront to them. They think that the person is trying to get back at them for something, and they won't face the issue. And the issue is, was a sin committed or was it not? He's taking into consideration, we've got 2 mature people. If we have 2 mature people, then you'll have this result to verse 15, he shall hear thee. And then you'll have the final result, you'll gain your brother, thou hast gained thy brother. In verse 16, what he's really presupposing here, I mean, he's presupposing throughout this all, remember, that the one who takes the initiative to go to someone else and say, listen, you've sinned, that one is right. And I've said the odds are probably in that favor, that individual is going to be the one correct in the situation because he was the first one to recognize that a sin has been committed. Even though it might be easier, as I started off saying, for the one against whom the sin was committed to recognize it than for the one who committed the sin, nevertheless, that's the order in which it's stated here. That's the order in which it should be stated because it's most significant that it's stated that way. Someone has to have the upper hand in spiritual recognition to know whether or not a sin has been committed. Probably it'll be the one who didn't commit the sin, you see. Or if he's so spiritual, why is he always committing sins? It's the one who didn't commit the sin, but who recognized the sin, who had the ability scripturally and biblically to recognize that, and therefore he goes to the individual. In this second step, however, we don't have two mature people. We only have one. That's the one who takes the initiative. That's the one against whom the sin has been committed. Because Jesus says, but if he will not hear. Now you can't say, well, now what if really no sin had been committed? Because he's basing all of this on verse 15. Moreover, if thy brother shall sin against thee. He didn't say, now, if you think that he did, but he really didn't, even though if you're convinced that he did, you still have to go to him, and hopefully it'll be in that confrontation you'll find out otherwise. He's not basing it on a what-if situation here. He's basing it on if your brother sins against thee. Then here we have one immature individual, and that is a person who will not hear. Who will not hear. How often does the Bible, dear friends, speak of those who are unwilling to be confronted with their sins, whether by God or by other people? Israel of the Old Testament, what was God's cry against them? I sent my prophets, they preached and prophesied, but Israel would not hear. Oh, she heard, but she would not hear to the intent of being convinced, convicted, and then conform her life to the message of the prophets. Immature Israel was unspiritual Israel, was unregenerate Israel. We're not saying this individual is unregenerate, but he's going to end up being counted that way if the steps go too far. So, learn a lesson from Jesus' teaching on forgiveness here. To be wise enough and mature enough to admit that you have made a mistake, committed a sin, you do have a shortcoming, you have done a fault to someone else. Then verse 15 will take care of it. You'll listen to your brother, you'll agree with your brother, you'll repent, you'll confess, he'll forgive, and Jesus said, and you'll be gained. Thou hast gained thy brother. Okay, let's go on in verse 16 and see what else we have. If he does not hear, don't get lost in all of my technicalities, don't get lost in all of that in trying to figure out, now, what are the salient points here? We're just giving it. He gives them verse 15, verse 16, and then verse 17, point by point by point. Go confront. You've done that. You tried that yesterday afternoon over our house. You tried it this morning at work or something, or last night on the telephone, and he would not hear. All right, here's the next step. If he will not hear thee, does this sound harsh to anyone? Does this sound harsh? Does this not make all the sense in the world? Amen. That you have to get everything out in what we call the open? We're always talking about that around here, out in the open. We're brothers, we're sisters. Why can't you go to someone and tell the person you've sinned against me without that person getting all bent out of shape over it? Who do you think you are? Pointing out my sins, blah, 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 on and on. You see, that's an immature individual who can't sit there and maturely receive what's said and agree, yes, you're exactly right, I've sinned and I'm very sorry for what I've done. This, to some people, I guess, would sound a little harsh because it almost sounds like it doesn't come from Jesus' lips. I thought he just taught love, love, love. You know, their idea of his teaching of love, love, love. He did teach love, 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 but maybe not their idea of that. This is love right here. This isn't a personal feud between two people. What's the point of verse 15? Thou hast shown thyself to be more spiritual? No, thou hast gained thy brother. It's a positive result for the sinner, not a positive result for the one sinned against. Not thou hast shown thyself to be the one who never committest any sins in thy life. That's not the point. The point is you've done something for your brother. Thou hast gained thy brother. People get this whole thing misconstrued and therefore find it next to impossible to receive any form of correction at all. Particularly, we might add, if it comes from a lesser person than you. You know, lesser people can sometimes spot greater things than greater people because they're a lesser person. Because they're lesser, they're involved with lesser things, so they have greater time to see the greater things in. If all of that makes any sense. It doesn't seem harsh to me at all. It just seems like this is what I would want to take place in my family, with my wife, with my children, with my parents, with you, that I would just want to take place so that we don't even have to get into verses 16 and 17. Verse 17 leads to excommunication. Can you believe that? Because someone will not confess their sin. Because they'll not confess their sin, it leads to excommunication. That's how serious this is. It's not harsh at all. It should be a joyful time of repentance and confession and hugging and kissing and warm embracing and getting back on right standing with God and with your brother. You know what he has said earlier here in verse 6, if you offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better that you would be excommunicated. Excommunicated from the world, that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Whoso shall offend one of these little ones. Now, he doesn't just mean offend, he means offend in the sense of sin. He uses that term in verse 7. One to the world because of offenses. These are sins. He said it's impossible for the world to live apart from offenses. It must needs be that offenses come. They're predetermined, predestined to come. But then he warns for personal, individual responsibility by going on to say, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. And by the way, in that verse right there, just like in the verses that speak of the betrayal of Judas Iscariot, you see in the selfsame verse God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. He said it must needs be. That's one of the strongest ways of expressing that this is the only way it can be, that the world is going to be a world filled with sin, filled with offenses, plural. There's the sovereignty of God. He's ordained that that's what's going to happen because of the present condition of the world. But then he goes on to warn, but woe to that man. Now he speaks of human responsibility here. Offenses are going to come. They're going to come through people. Guard yourself that those offenses don't work their way through you to others. That's what he's saying. You have your own human responsibility. Woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. And whenever someone commits a sin against another brother or against another sister, it is an offense. It's a sin of offense to them. And think what Christ thinks if you cause that person to stumble by that. He doesn't think very highly. That brings to mind, if you'll turn over to 1 Corinthians, Paul's teaching on that, about eating meat and idols and all of this. Yeah, this is exact same teaching. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Verse 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 10. For if any man see thee which hast knowledge sit at meat in an idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Christ. Wherefore if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, or while the age remains, lest I make my brother to offend. That's very strong teaching of the Apostle Paul's. Verse 12, if ye sin so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, then ye sin against Christ. That's why in some of the developments of the church recently, maybe I have done some of these things myself. I'm speaking of the developments over the past year or so, but I don't tell other people about them. Why? Because you can wound, you can damage, you can harm other people's weak conscience. Their conscience is not where yours is because they're still back with the old way of thinking and you're thinking with a new way of thinking now. And therefore, to wound them and them see you do this or them see you say this could be a great offense to them, could cause them some damage. Well, anyway, back to Matthew chapter 18. We're just looking at this because of the significance of what sin is and of what sin does to other members of the church. And that's why the solution always has to be confrontation. Confrontation in the Christian sense of the term, not in an evil manner, but in a good manner as Jesus prescribes. If he will not hear thee, however, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. Now don't think of Gestapo mentality now when you look at this and think, well, one dark night, 3 people with top coats on are going to knock on my door and say, now, we are the two witnesses with this brother here that you've sinned. There has to be more genuineness and more friendliness involved in that. That just comes to my mind. I can picture, you're going to go find 2 or 3 witnesses, and you're going to come in a smoke-filled, dark chamber and corner that person and say, now, fess up or be excommunicated, or fess up or we'll tell the church on you. It's not like that. These 2 or 3 witnesses that you take with you, these guys are going with you because they're concerned about that person, not so much concerned about your reputation, the one against whom the sin was committed. They want to do verse 15, gain their brother. Thou hast gained their brother. That's always what they're after. Thou hast gained their brother. They're wanting to gain the brother. He gives us step after step to gain the brother. And if the brother, by his lack of being gained, shows that he does not desire to be gained, then don't gain him, Jesus said, but lose him from your midst. And it's called excommunication. Now, here's the question, though, that we're going to have to deal with in this second step in verse 16. Do these people, the 1 or 2, the 2 or 3, the 1 or 2 witnesses, 2 or 3 total, do these 1 or 2 people have to be witnesses of the sin? He doesn't tell us 1 or 2 what. It's just 1 or 2 more. So we'd probably think, well, what can we have more? Well, not 1 or 2. I guess you could think 1 or 2 more people against whom this same individual has sinned, but that's probably not what he means. Or we could just think the only thing we have thus far is a person. So 1 or 2 more of those would be 1 or 2 more people. But then he goes on to say, in quoting from Deuteronomy, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. Well, you see the question we ask from this. What if you don't have any witnesses? What if you don't have any witnesses to the sin that was committed against you? Then that makes me ask another question. How often is it really when you have witnesses to personal sin, to a sin that's been committed against you? I think that'd be very, very rare. It's generally, over the telephone or in a letter or out when you're together or something like that, someone commits a sin against you. And do you really have any witnesses? About the only time you would have a witness is when you yourself are not a witness to the sin, and that's when someone speaks behind your back. Then you've got 1 or 2 witnesses, those people to whom that individual was speaking. But you don't know anything about the sin except from secondhand knowledge. That person has come and reported it to you. Therefore, it couldn't be 1 or 2 more people who are witnesses because you're not a witness. So we can't have more if we don't have 1 to begin with. Let's go back to Deuteronomy and see what chapter 19 and verse 15 says. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15. One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth. Notice the repetition that's used here. And repetition many times points towards importance or significance. One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth. So Jesus is specializing. We could say he's specializing this verse because he turns it into brother-to-brother sin. Whereas this says any sin. Maybe you saw someone sin a sin against God, like, blaspheme or carry sticks on the Sabbath day. That's not a sin against you. That's a sin against God. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3. All right, now whenever he says that, follow this very intricate logic now. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses. Go back to Matthew 18, verse 16. Jesus said, take with thee 1 or 2. Deuteronomy says 2 or 3. Deuteronomy calls them witnesses, 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses. Jesus said take 1 or 2 more, so that when you add yourself as one of those, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, you're back to the Deuteronomy 2 or 3, and not to the Matthew 18, 16, 1 or 2, which only can prove what he's talking about whenever he says 1 or 2 more is what he goes on to say in this verse, one or two more witnesses. Not just anybody, but one or two more witnesses. That's what Deuteronomy says. At the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of three. So that includes yourself as a witness. That includes one other person or two other people as a witness or as witnesses, so that the matter may be established. Okay, what do we do with this word witness then? Now we know we have to all be witnesses, either both of us or all three of us. So that at the mouth of two or three witnesses, including yourself, that gives one or two others. What do we mean by witness? Well, I don't think in the Matthew passage, and we're going to see this in another here in a moment, that there's any way we can take witness to mean witness as a witness in the police report of an automobile accident. What type of witness do we have there? What we call an eyewitness. Some news broadcaster called eyewitness because they saw it. I like to spell it eyewitness with a capital I. They're just witnessing to everything, not E-Y-E. But they mean E-Y-E, eyewitness. That's not what he means here. Because of the improbability of that in so many, many cases. Then we wouldn't have any biblical teaching. What if a brother has sinned against you and you don't have any, quote, witnesses, end of quote. You don't have any eyewitnesses. Well, you can go to thee and him alone, verse 15, and as long as he knows this passage here, and he also is cognizant of the fact you don't have any witnesses, all he has to do is refuse to be gained. And then you can never go to the 16th verse and the second step because you have no witnesses on your side. You see what I'm saying? Obviously, he couldn't speak. He is not speaking of people who were witnesses of the fact. If he's not speaking of that, then of what is he speaking? We're back to maturity again. They don't have to be witnesses. They have to be people that are knowledgeable about the offense which has been committed and in tune with the Bible on what is right and what is wrong, and therefore who is right and who is wrong. Get that down, then I'll comment more about that, because if you think like I do, I can see problems with what I just said. They don't have to be eyewitnesses. They have to be people that are knowledgeable about the offense. In other words, before I give you the rest of that sentence, in other words, think of Jesus' trial. They tried to bring witnesses against him. What type of witnesses did they bring? Guys who they just picked up off the street, who knew nothing at all. And they told them what to go in and say whenever they went in to say. And some went in, well, this man said this. And another witness went in, he said this. And we're told in the Gospels that he was not convicted on that basis because their witnesses did not agree. Okay, what are we talking about? Eyewitnesses there? No, we're talking about witnesses. They're not eyewitnesses. They're not witnesses in the sense of Matthew 18 because they're not knowledgeable of anything. They are false witnesses. That's what we're told there. False, not in the sense that they're not an eyewitness. That's not what he's talking about there. But false in the sense they don't know what's going on. They have no biblical knowledge. They have no scriptural teaching. Therefore, they're not worthy to present a case against Jesus in favor of the charge against him of blasphemy. They couldn't do that. They don't know anything about the Bible. They don't know what constitutes blasphemy or not. They don't know what Jesus has said. Either first hand or second hand or third hand, they simply pick them up off the street, put words in their mouth and say, go in and say this. And it just doesn't work out because you know how it happens whenever you tell someone something and they tell someone else something. It never comes out the same way it originally began. And so their witnesses do not agree. So if you take into consideration what's going to later be said in Matthew's Gospel, as well as in some of the others concerning Jesus' trial and these false witnesses, then it tells us something about what a witness was. So I said it's not an eyewitness, but one who's knowledgeable about the offense. And he's knowledgeable about the offense through the one offended. Now that would be, of course, the problem in the case. The one against whom the sin is committed, would not he be biased or prejudiced? So he's going to make the story look more in his favor and more against the other person whenever he's trying to tell one or two witnesses the facts of the account. And this witness or these witnesses have to be in tune with the Bible's teaching on what's right and what's wrong, therefore who's right and who's wrong. So we have some other assumptions. This passage is remarkable because it's so filled with assumptions or presuppositions here. Jesus is assuming here the honesty and the integrity of the one sinned against. Can't we all see that? If no one's an eyewitness and you're going to have to, let's just take an example. Here's our brother on the front row that he was sinned against by this brother right here. And no one witnessed that at all. And he goes to him and tells him his sin, and he does not hear him. That's verse 16. But if he will not hear, that he does not hear him. So he gets this brother and that brother. He gets two witnesses. Do they witness anything? No. How do they know anything about the sin? This brother's going to sit these two down and tell them the whole story. Can't he just really fabricate a story here and tell them to make himself look good and make him look bad? Well, certainly he can't. But what other way do we have around this? If Jesus is going to say, go get witnesses, and we know that the person could spin a whole web of a lie here, but that Jesus intends for us to understand this man's not going to lie here. He's going to try to tell the story to the best of his knowledge and not favor anyone. You don't have to favor someone. Whenever a sin has been committed, sin will point its own finger without you pointing the finger. Sin will point its own finger at this brother who's done the wrong. Therefore, he's going to tell these two brothers all that he knows about the story. This is his one witness, or if he wants two, he can pick this other brother as another witness. Okay, that's what we have here.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape.
This is his one witness, or if he wants two, he can pick this other brother as another witness. Okay, that's what we have here. These guys have to be knowledgeable about the offense, and their knowledge is going to be based on what he has to tell them. They also, because think of how the different levels of maturity, and you go pick out these two brothers, some sin, and they say, I don't think that's a sin. Maybe they're not knowledgeable of the Bible. Maybe they're not mature. They have to be knowledgeable about the account, the event, number one, from this brother. Number two, they have to be knowledgeable from the Word of God as to what constitutes right and wrong, and therefore who is in the right and who is in the wrong in this case. Therefore, obviously, Jesus is implying maturity, spiritual, biblical, scriptural teaching maturity in this whole case. Therefore, you would pick your witnesses very carefully. You wouldn't have to pick your mother and your father, your wife, your friend, your business partner. Maybe those people aren't mature, biblically or spiritually speaking. You don't have to pick someone who's close to you to make sure they stay on your side in the story. But just to be spiritual, you don't have to pick someone who hates you in the church either, though. If they hate you, that's not biblical right away for hating you. So they're not mature. So I wouldn't pick them as a witness. You would pick one or two people who are knowledgeable about the Scriptures. Not just so they would agree with you, but if you're right, after all, you're right. And why wouldn't we agree with you? I wouldn't agree with you to be agreeing with you. I would agree with you because you agree with the Bible. And I want to agree with the Bible. And that makes me in agreement with you. And that makes me in disagreement with the man who's committed the sin. You following all of this? You see how all of this works itself out here? You see how you do have the right then, after the first step, in taking the second step, to violate, as it were, 1 Peter 4:8b, love covers a multitude of sins? Because the person, more or less, who did the sinning has asked you to violate that. They don't want their sin covered anymore. You covered it. You hid it. You didn't tell anyone. You went between thee and him alone. Did he do anything about it? No. He justified himself. He said, you're wrong. He said, you're out to notch your gun. You're out headhunting or something. And who are you? And you're not perfect. And I saw you and I blah, 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 on and on and on. He wants you not to cover his sin anymore. So, in accordance with teaching from Jesus' own lips. This isn't the Apostle Paul's teaching, although if it were, we would take it just as strongly as from Jesus. But you have to go and find one or two more witnesses. Not who will agree with you, but agree with the Bible and therefore agree with you. Okay, with that settled, let's look at verse 16 again here then. If he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more. He doesn't tell you which of those. He says or. You can go find one more, or you can go find two more. That in the mouth of two or three, so that when you add yourself, now you have two or three. 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. I mean, he's quoting Deuteronomy 19:15, that the matter may be established. The same terminology even used in both places, that every word may be established. He's assuming, I'm giving you some more of the assumptions here, therefore, that either the 2 or the 3 people involved in the forgiveness committee, we will call them, either the 2 or 3 people involved in the forgiveness committee have a satisfactory, it doesn't have to be total, total is probably impossible, a satisfactory command of the facts of the matter. How many of us ever have the total command of the facts? We don't. We just don't have total command. He's assuming that the forgiveness committee, headed by Deacon Brown, has a satisfactory command of the facts of the matter. And that they are faithfully represented among these people. Let's say we've got 3 people, or between these if we have 2. Now, you see, that gets a little more embarrassing for the sinner, and it should be. He's a sinner. He's not one who is right now. Jesus said if you sin against your brother, he's a sinner. It's a little more embarrassing for him because now either 1 or 2 more people know about his sin. Okay, let's move on to the third step. Verse 17 gives us the third and the fourth step. There's 4 steps. There are 4 steps through this all. Confront your brother alone. Confront your brother with 1 or 2 more. Third step, if he shall neglect to hear them. Well, I'm sure he heard what they said, but hear to the intent of receiving and changing. Then tell it unto the church. This is just brother to brother sin. There are other things to be taken into consideration if the person's a different type of sinner than brother to brother sinner. If he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. Third step. Fourth step, if he neglect to hear the church, then let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. Now those 2 steps, 3 and 4, are church discipline steps, not interpersonal relationship steps. That's why I'm not commenting on them in this study on forgiveness. We're just going to assume now if someone sins against another person, one of these first 2 steps will take care of it. We're hoping for the best. Thou hast gained thy brother is that for which we are hoping. Those 2 steps, A and B, of verse 17, 17a and 17b, are just, they're in a different area. They're church discipline steps. So I'm skipping over those to comment on them. We're just dealing with the person-to-person confrontation. Now notice it's not so much person-to-person anymore. Now the person is pretty much on their own. You go and tell the church, and then if they don't hear the church, then it's church against them. It's a plurality of people against them. And then if they neglect to hear the church, it's always go tell, but if they will not hear, go tell, but if they will not hear, go tell, but if they will not hear, then let them go. Let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. Now, isn't that just as clear as crystal, as they say? As clear as crystal.
Amen.
That's one of these issues, one of these passages in the Bible on which very little interpretation is really needed. We just need some common sense to ask ourselves questions like, well, what if the one who takes the account before the sinner, what if really the man didn't sin? And do we have to have people who actually were eyewitnesses of the account? And what if we have women involved and a woman was sinned against by a man? All we need really is a little common sense in all of these things. It's a step by step by step, 3 steps if you don't count excommunication. Some commentators don't. 4 steps if you count that last and final one. Step by step, clear as crystal procedure as to what we should do. I think that the misunderstanding and the misconception enters the picture, listen to me clearly, over a misconception of love. It enters the picture over a misconception of love. We think that we know what love means, and because our thoughts of love are not true, we love the person more than we love God's holiness, which is not true love, not in its deepest sense. Person, if you don't love God and His holiness. But because we think that way, we do nothing about the sin. And you could even add a footnote. I think that's the general reason, the general misconception, but a footnote you could add would be Faith Assembly's teaching. It's why you don't understand Matthew 18, because Faith Assembly teaches what? Deeper life. Just endure things. Crucified. They reason like this. If you're on a cross, then how can you talk? How could someone sin against you on a cross? Well, Jesus said they could, because He teaches these very people that He's talking about here, you have to crucify yourself daily and follow me, but He still says, moreover, if thy brother, who's hanging on that cross beside you, sin against you, then here are the things to do. So it's either a misconception of love or misconception of deeper life, Spirit-filled life, Spirit-led life, crucified life, or whatever from Faith Assembly that would maybe make people violate the clear teaching here of Jesus in Matthew 18. Then we have 3 final verses. This is a 6-verse section. Verses 15, 16, and 17 are the first half that give us the procedure. Verses 18, 19, and 20 are the conclusion. And I'm sure most people are more familiar with those 3 verses than they are the first 3. And my comment on these 3 is interesting. That's my comment. Interesting. It's very interesting that these 3 verses are connected to those first 3. They're connected in, and this is a sequence passage, notice. Nothing's out of order here. 17 is not chronologically or theologically or in whatever way prior to verse 15. They're right in order. So then comes 18, then comes 19, then comes 20. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. He says it earlier back here in chapter 16, which is a similar passage. It's the other place where church is found in Matthew. It's a very, very similar case here. But this is in a different context. It's in a different context than what we have in chapter 16. And whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say unto you. Again I say unto you. That was a verily statement. This is again one. Verily is verse 18. Again I say unto you, that if 2 of you shall agree on earth concerning anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. In other words, I wonder if there is a connection between verse 19 and verse 16. It talks about 2 people in verse 16. If you only have 1 witness, that'd be the least possible, plus yourself would equal 2. I wonder if there's any connection between those 2 people, 2 witnesses to a man's sin, and the 2 people who are agreeing about something. Agreeing about something in verse 19. He does go on to say they're asking about or for something, but it doesn't really say pray as such. That if 2 of you shall agree on earth concerning anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. For where 2 or 3, now we're back to the maximum number. If you can find 2 witnesses plus yourself equal 3. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Now, Scripture can have another meaning because that meaning is found in some other Scripture, but this is used for home prayer groups, verse 20. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. And I suppose, that's true, whether it's in church discipline or interpersonal relationship discipline or some other case, I'm sure that it's true. But my point is it's found here, and it's not in the book of Acts chapter 2 or Revelation chapter 14 where you're in the tribulation and you don't have anyone around but two or three, and so you're glad that Jesus has promised to be there. It's not found in that context. It's found right here. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Okay, without commenting too much upon that either. So we're skipping those 4 verses, 17, 18, 19, and 20. In verse 21, this all seems to be in the stated given order in which it transpired. In verse 21, Peter returns to the subject of what? Now, he could have taken anything. He could have taken the 2 or 3 gathering together, church. He could have said, church, Jesus, what's church? Is that Baptist, Pentecostal? What type of church are you talking about? The binding and the loosing, a charismatic would have returned to that verse, binding and loosing. Praying, touching anything, laying hands on the radio, prayer clause. You could have returned to many topics in verses 15 through 20. He returns to the subject of sin and particularly forgiveness. Forgiveness. That shows us what this whole passage is about. 15 to 20 is about sin and forgiveness. Not about home prayer groups, not about binding demons or loosing finances so you can have a better life or something. It's not about that at all. Then came Peter to him and said, in other words, this must have been a little heavy, as they say, for Peter. Peter, he missed all that teaching about binding and loosing. All he heard was, your brother sins against me, and I'm supposed to... And notice Peter says, forgive him. So that's part of our basis for taking the variant sin against thee, brother to brother, because forgiveness is implied here, although it's not stated. What gives Peter the problem is not his brother's sin, but Peter's willingness to forgive. Must have been pretty heavy teaching for him. Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me? Jesus just said, if your brother sin. So, maybe that's one time. And then Peter's really bold. He says, I could do it 7 times. How oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? That's important, that phrase, forgive him. That must be understood in verse 15 then, and verse 16, and verse 17. After each of those 3 confrontations, we should be willing to forgive if the man sins and is willing to hear us, as Jesus said. If he hear thee, if he hear thee, if he hear thee. Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Now, Peter is willing to forgive more than double what the rabbis taught. And he wants to know if this is acceptable. The rabbis taught you should forgive 2 or 3 times. Maximum of 3 times should you forgive your brother if he sins against you. And you have to kind of know that to get Peter's point here. The rabbis, we find in rabbinical writings, they taught forgive a maximum of 3 times. Preferably 2. But a maximum of 3 times. And Peter says, I'll double plus I'll add 1 of the requirements of the rabbis. The rabbis that were living during their day, Jesus knows what he's talking about, what Peter's talking about. Peter knows what he's talking about. Peter said, I'll double my times of forgiveness that the rabbis demand of me, plus I'll add 1. They say 3, I'll double that 6 and add 1 until 7 times. And Jesus said, I say not unto thee, Simon Peter, until 7 times. Doubling plus adding 1 to the rabbis is not enough because you're missing the spirit of what I'm saying then. You're counting up. You're adding up the times. You don't really have or really want a relationship between you and your brother. You're trying to live according to a set standard. 3 times. Double that, add 1. 7 times. 14 times. 21 times. You have your eyes not on gaining your brother. If you have to forgive him 500 times, if you can win him on that 500th time, that should make it all worthwhile then. That should make it all worthwhile. Peter doesn't want to gain his brother. That's what we must take from this. Peter wants to hit whatever the required number of times is. So it's like the brother sinned over here, and Peter's not thinking of that. He just turns and said, I forgive you, and then looks back up there to see how many numbers are chalked up for him. He looks, I forgive you, looks back up. There's no relationship between he and his brother. Only a relationship between him and the calculator to see how many times he has to forgive. So Jesus just strikes that out. I say not unto thee. It's a very strong term. I say not unto thee until 7 times. But until 70 times 7, or until 70 and 7 times, depending on how you interpret this passage. Not so much a textual problem, definitely not a textual problem, but one of interpretation. And I'm not going to get into that because the authorities, the good authorities, are about equally divided. And I don't think that the number is that important anyway. 70 times 7, that's 490 times. But is that really any more than 77? I mean, if you can forgive someone 77 times, I assume you can forgive them 490 times too. But you may want to make a note of that. There's no agreement at all whether it should be 77 or 490. Those are the two numbers involved. I don't think the numbers are that important, either 77 or 490. Because we could always raise it one. Okay, does that mean you don't have to forgive the 78th or the 491st time? Well, would you have to forgive that time? The 78th time? What if it was the 491st? Okay, if you say yes, you would have to forgive, then that proves numbers are not what he's talking about here. He's just using a big number. Either 77, so it looks like we've got some 7s multiplied. Peter used the term 7, the number 7. Or 490, so it looks like we have the number 7 multiplied a few times. Peter, by using the number 7, may have implied something in the area of completeness. 7 was a number of completeness. God made the world in 7 days. But he didn't have in his mind the biblical idea of completeness and forgiveness, because completeness has no number. That's the point. This is, I guess we all knew this verse from Sunday school, the 3rd grade. I don't know if Laura did. I only say that because of a conversation we had, not to embarrass her. Sometimes she says I say things, we all learn that in Sunday school, and she said none of us have heard of those things in Sunday school. Well, I certainly have this verse many times. You knew you're supposed to forgive 70 times 7, and we always said 490 times, and then we would argue for the rest of the Sunday school class about that 491st time. Should you forgive that 491st time? Which I think destroyed the whole lesson we were supposed to be learning in Sunday school. Anyway, what he's saying is nothing is too bad and nothing is too often repeated to be forgiven. That's the stress of what he's saying, and using whatever large number, either 77 or 490. Nothing is too bad or too often repeated for you to forgive. Nothing is too bad or too often repeated for you to forgive. Wow. No one said wow. Do you believe that? Do you practice that? Go ahead and be honest. No. All right, be honest. Not really, someone says. Nothing is too bad or too often repeated. It's almost impossible teaching to live up to. You know of someone, let's take a husband or a wife. They're the number one ones who sin against you because you're around them all the time. 490 times she does it. Or he. 490 times. Be honest now. You'd have her with a whip, or you'd have a gun before his face in a hurry. 400. I mean, that really impresses me. Or 77 impresses me. Peter, 7 impresses me. 7 times, because you want to say, I told you. 490 times. Boy, that would make a good marriage, one worth writing about. Not that you've got a sinner that bad, but one half of the marriage is willing to forgive so often. 490 times. You see, it's your long suffering that we have studied, that virtue earlier. It's your long suffering that puts you in the position that really compels you to continue to forgive. Long suffering for a long time. 490 is a long time. 7 could be a long time with certain sins. What about if it was the sin of unfaithfulness? 7 times. And they came back willing to repent and come back into your graces 7 times. And I mean come back into your graces 7 times, or 77, or 490. That would be a record, I guess, if it was that many times. You need to go into the business. You can make more money that way than being a housewife. But, does not this person's repeated sin say something about him? I mean, he's trying to get across a certain point to those of us on the good side, the non-sinning side. That is the subject of forgiveness here. Should we really be willing to forgive a person who shows something wrong about themselves by committing a sin not 4-fold or 7-fold, but 490-fold? Are there not other things to consider whether you should forgive or not? The willingness to forgive is one question. Whether you are obligated to forgive, is that another? I'm asking these questions. So willingness to forgive. Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Jesus is teaching that we should be willing to forgive 77 or 490 times. By the way, the parable of this slave, the unmerciful slave in verses 23 and 25, I said just a moment ago, nothing is too bad or nothing is too often repeated to be forgiven. And I said that because of the way this is set up. In verse 22, we have nothing is too often done. In the parable, we have nothing is too bad. Because remember this huge debt that he owed, and then other debts that people owed him. There's the nothing too bad. And in verse 22 is the nothing too often repeated. Can you forgive a person? Are you allowed to? Can you forgive a person 490 times? Or to say it another way, is that person able to repent 490 times? Does it not say something about the individual to have sinned 7 or 77 or 490 or 4,990 times? What if the brother just continues to sin against you? Are we just automatically to continue to forgive him? Aren't there other things to consider? Does not forgiveness involve the question of interpersonal relationships and not a mechanical notion of if he did me wrong, then I owe him my forgiveness? That sounds like a good place to stop. You think about those questions, and we'll start answering some of those here very soon. I mean, you could just read this and just think you got the answer right away. Well, I'm going to forgive even if he never repents. I'd forgive him 490 times. Is that what Jesus is really teaching? We will see as we further develop this study.
Only be still, to rest in it, nest in